You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode. Welcome back, everyone, here to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered, where we have today what I am sure is going to be a very interesting conversation. I've been looking forward to this. We have a guest on with us here today. His name is Chris Jones, and he is the host of the Spiritual Hot Sauce podcast, which is for the curious, the questioning, and everyone in between. Now, I found out about Chris and his podcast. Let's see. When was the first time you had Kyle Whitaker on?
Kyle was probably
around
early
Christmas,
on.
I think, right?
Yeah, a little before Christmas, I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because I released a Christmas special, and I think before the Christmas special, he was on. Yeah.
Yeah. And for those of you who have listened for a while, you may remember we had Kyle and his friend Randy on from Pastor and Philosopher back when we did our Ecclesiastes series. They were a great addition to that. And whenever I see Kyle is on something, I always like listen to him and learn from him. So I saw he was on Chris's. I said, I should give that a listen. And I thought, maybe I should give a few more of these episodes a listen. Then he had Randy on shortly after, and Kyle came back on again recently. So it took me a few months, but I worked my way through all of Chris's episodes, and I've enjoyed them. He brings really unique perspective of philosophy, theology. He talks Jungian archetypes and stuff. He's all over the place on what he brings to this podcast with stuff that you don't hear in church. It's so cool. So I wanted to share this conversation with you all. And Chris, I want to say thank you for joining us here today. Welcome to the
Thank you, Colin, for allowing me to join you here. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to this, and this should be fun.
Yeah, me too. And I got to start with the obvious question. Why spiritual hot sauce?
It's different,
of all the names you could go with. Where's that one coming from?
You know, I started this podcast because everything kind of organically grew for me. You know, I had some experiences, and I ended up kind of being in isolation, and I started diving into the scriptures and getting a different understanding than what most people would come away thinking. And it was just me and the Bible. And organically, I started teaching a Bible class, a Bible study. And did that for a couple of years. It's still going on. I put somebody in as my replacement. Then I started speaking in church. And this just seemed like the natural progression was the podcast. But because I am so different, to your point, I could not come up with a name. And I was having dinner one night, and I looked up and I seen hot sauce. And I realized what hot sauce does is it doesn't change what you're consuming or have been consuming. But what it does is it allows you to enjoy the food from a different perspective. It adds different flavors and it takes some away. The dish hasn't changed, but what the hot sauce does is it allows you to experience or see a different perspective of that dish. So I thought that's perfect. That's spiritual hot sauce. So that's all I'm trying to do is allow you from a different lens or perspective to see what you may have grown up with, but in a different way.
I like that. I do. I'm a little bit of a sriracha guy. So we'll see if we can add some spiritual sriracha here today to what we know about the Bible, right?
Yeah. I'm all over the place with hot sauces. I love it all. So yeah, sriracha's great, but anything with habanero, it's just habanero gets hot really fast, but it was my favorite smoky pepper flavor. It's just too hot. You know, it's too hot. So I'm on jalapeno most of the time, but yeah.
I realized I had a problem with hot sauce when I was in college, and I always wanted to put sriracha on stuff, and they never had it in the kitchen. So I started carrying my own bottle with me to class so I could have it at lunch.
That's funny.
Yeah, the important stuff you keep in college.
Yeah, that's right.
So like I mentioned in the intro, one of the things that I think really makes your approach so unique is how you blend in, not just talking about the Bible or your own faith journey, but you're bringing in aspects of psychology, philosophy, like we said, Jungian archetypes as they relate to spirituality. So I guess my first question with that is, where did you learn some of that? Because that's not the normal stuff that gets brought up in a church sermon.
Yeah, you're right. And if I'm being honest, most of that I learned, it's like the psychology and everything else you're talking about. I mean, and I do get into it, but it actually came from that time of me studying the Bible. And then as I'm trying to figure out and get my head around what I've just learned, I start reaching for other things. And then I end up in archetypal information, or I end up in psychology or neuroscience. And it helps me to explain things to other people, you know. And truthfully, on the podcast, if I'm being honest, sometimes I feel like I lean into that too much. And I just need to say, hey, here's a scripture, here's how I read it. You know, you make of it what you want. But that's why I do it. And it's not like I go out and study Jungian archetype or the hero's journey, although I seem to have, I get asked about it a lot. And I did a big deep dive into it. But it's not my primary thing, it's other things that I look at. I think what I do is I have what I understand from the scriptures, and then I'll bring up other things that I consider to be universal truths, and then I'll look at it through those lenses, and, I kind of make my way around. I'm not a biblical isolationist. I think that gets you sometimes into a weird place, but I think by bringing other things and still prioritizing the Bible as the number one thing, but seeing it from these different lenses and perspectives, is it enlightens things and opens them up. And sometimes a lot of times it verifies and explains why I'm reading it like I am. So that happens a lot. But yeah. It's not my primary. Yeah. So I'm not meaning to do that. It's just, it's a better vehicle way of explaining to other people of how I interpret it and why I get the interpretation. So if I say to you, it's like on the compass, which we'll probably talk about north and south,
for sure.
that I got that from actually Jesus talking about the thorns in Luke chapter 8, verses 11 through 15. Now, to help you understand that from a psychology perspective, it's easier for me to say, hey, it's the rider and the elephant. It's your internal battle. Oh, from a neuroscience, it's your limbic system, and it's your prefrontal cortex. It's that battle that's going on in your center. So maybe I need to quit doing that so much and just say, hey, here's what the Bible says.
No, I don't think so, because I grew up in independent fundamental Baptist circles.
Okay.
So I had very heavy, like, King James onlyism kind of fundamentalism.
Yeah.
And when we came to a scripture passage, often just looked at whatever commentaries we had. I was going back to Spurgeon or Augustine or whatever. And this is why I like that you bring that. And I would actually say keep going with it. Is those are angles I don't think the average person in the pew is getting. And it really helps to give you a unique perspective on the scriptures. And at least I personally like hearing the background of how you got to it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, apparently what I'm trying to do worked because you understood it. So yeah, good.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah. And you know what? You brought up the compass, so let's go ahead and talk about that here. Give me a little bit of the background, because you said that came from the parable of the thorns.
The sower and the word and the thorns is in there.
Yes.
Yeah. So I came up with to try to help people and believers in navigating their life and adversity and suffering, mainly suffering, because I deal with it a lot on the podcast. And I said that north on our compass represents our emotions. It's our wants, our needs, our desires, our fears, and emotions want immediate gratification. They don't understand investment of long-term behaviors. Now, the polar opposite of that is what the Bible would call our cardia. It's our heart, our center, our essence. And in the Greek, emotions is not in the definition. Emotions is something different, just like I'm explaining it now. So when Jesus is teaching this, they would have understood this perfectly. But south represents our will. It's how we choose. It's choosing to do hard things now that we don't want to do to get to a better place later, or to avoid big bad suffering later. But it's the
okay. So let's pause you before you get to east and west then. So with the way you're explaining heart, when that shows up in scripture, I think a lot of people imagine emotions. We're used to listen to your heart, follow your heart, that kind of thing in English. But you're suggesting it's more of a will. So if you read something like love the Lord your God with all your heart, it's not necessarily commanding you to feel an emotion. It would more so be saying to direct your will toward him.
Yeah, it's how you choose. It's ancient Greek. It's your choices. It's your center, your essence. It's your will. It makes up who you are. And that the internal battle within ourselves, it is these two things. Like we said, in psychology, we would call it the rider and the elephant. I'm sure you're familiar with that term. that it is your part of your body and that wants immediate gratification. I use the example of a donut. Now, say for every morning you wake up, you want donuts. And a lot of us are that way. I know I am,
Oh yeah.
And so if that's your limbic system, that's your ancient part of your brain. And your limbic system wants immediate gratification. It wants sugar. I want it now. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, your prefrontal cortex is saying, no, we're going to choose not to do that. And here's the weird thing is what neuroscience would tell us is that your limbic system, if you grab the donut and begin to eat it, it'll give you a shot of dopamine, rewarding you for grabbing those calories. But now your prefrontal cortex, if you say no, it will give you a shot of dopamine and reward you for saying no. So we have these two things internally going on that are fighting for kind of control. It's our internal battle. That's why I say north and south. Now, this, I say this is our religious part, if we're going to be talking from a faith aspect, our religious part. And I had said that I got this from Luke chapter 8, verses 11 through 15, in conjunction with James chapter 1. The two actually overlap each other. Amazing. It's like when Jesus hits it, James opens it up and just says, and this is what he's saying. It's pretty incredible. And I got this because when I was doing the Bible study, in the Bible study, I didn't do kind of what I do here. It's more of expository teaching. And I would go through James verse by verse, and it would take like 2 or 3 sessions at an hour shot to get through it. But I would tie in Luke 8:11 through 15. And what Jesus is saying, because there's something that happens, again, we're going into neuroscience. It's called executive order. And I'm not an academic, but you can go look this stuff up. And all I did was go look that up to confirm how I was reading this was right. But there's a thing called executive order that it's like being a child. And when you're doing something wrong and your parent or the teacher walks in, you immediately snap to, right? Your brains just yield to that authority and you line up to whatever that authority is. That's called executive order. Well, Jesus is saying in Luke 8:11 through 15 that if you'll take his word into your heart, your cardia, your will, and that's how you choose, it's like executive order. As it begins to grow and mature, it will start to control the other things. The Bible talks about us being living tabernacles. And if you think about, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go into, I don't want to go too far out here, but if you think about
no, go down the rabbit hole.
If you think about the first temple, it was in 3 parts. It had the outer courtyard, that was kind of our flesh. It had the holy place where only the priest could go. That's our mind. And then it had the holies of holies where no one could go except for the high priest, but only once a year for the atonement, Yom Kippur, which would be our spirit. Now, when it had all 3 parts in the Holy of Holies, it had the Spirit of God. The first temple had the Ark of the Covenant before it was destroyed by the Babylonians, I think in 585 BC. But before then, it was functioning as it should. And it took care of the people. It served the people. And it was a place where you could be encouraged and comforted. In other words, it served humanity. Now, later on, the second temple, the one that Darius, when it provided and got built for them because King Cyrus had ordered it after he freed them from the Babylonians, but it was Darius that actually made it happen for them. They built it, and it was made in 3 parts, except they didn't have the Ark of the Covenant. So it didn't have the Spirit of God. It wasn't in 3 parts. It was in 2 parts. So it had the outer courtyard, the flesh, and it had the mind or the will, but it didn't have anything living in the spirit. It was dead. So you said rabbit hole. So here we go. But if you think of the number 3 being the number of synthesis, then the number of synthesis is 3. It's full. It's the beginning, the middle, and the ending. That the first temple had the third. So it had this number. It belonged to something bigger. In music, there's something called Ionian theory, which means that there's only 7 notes in all of music, and they just continue up and continue down. But to know how you fit into that universe of sonic math, you have to have the third that determines major, minor, and where it belongs into the scale. So without that, you can have 2 notes that are tuned to themselves, but they don't belong to anything bigger. All they do is serve themselves. like the second temple. That's the one that Jesus showed up at, that was serving itself, and it demanded others serve it. Now, if we are the temple, and when Jesus is talking about the word, the executive order going into us, there's our third part where we start having this life. And now we belong to something bigger than ourselves. It's not just us serving ourselves. And in Luke 8:11 through 15, Jesus is warning about the things that will take that life from you. And one of them he calls the thorns. And it was cares, worries, anxiety, and it was money, and it was lust. It was hedonic, the root word for hedonism. That it was those three things. And I've thought of it as I was teaching it, learning about it, that as we are on our path and our journey, that we are going to have these things that tempt us. The word that gets used there by Jesus and by James is parasmos. Parasmos is a really cool word because in a negative context, it means temptation. It means that we are tempted. It is our physical body being tempted by being lost to anxiety or worry, or money, changing our course, our direction in life to get the money, or, for sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the stuff that just seems like a lot of fun. That as we're going through our path and our journey, if we start to change our direction and lean into that, Jesus calls it the thorns. And if you've seen somebody that struggles with the addiction, when they're lost in the thorns, it's unfortunate and it's horrific to watch, because now they have to watch everything they love in their life kind of walk away from them, because no one is going to stay with you in the thorns. And I think that's what Jesus is saying. You get stuck, you go a little deeper and deeper because the berry tastes good, It's like James says, once sin conceives and gives birth and it matures, it will bring death. I don't think he means death always physically, but it means death to everything you love. You will end up in a really bad place and watch life kind of go on without you, and you'll be stuck in the thorns. And I think that's what Jesus was talking about. So when you take this seed in this word, this executive order, now you have your compass of north and south. That was a long way to go. I'm sorry. But you have north and south, then religion, a good religion that serves you, not the one that you're serving this mountain that we make to God on merit base, but the one that is meant to serve you and have a better life. It helps you choose better. A lot of religions have dietary restrictions, and that's to help you have a better health, or not. We call them sin. Jesus called them thorns to his immediate disciples, things that will keep you from getting to the good stuff in life. That it's not about us just going hard south and giving up, everything that's in our emotions, but it's finding the balance in the center, because life is a marathon. It's not a sprint. So you want to get to the center as long as you can, because that's where the good things happen over a long-term investment of our behaviors. But, north also brings us love, and joy and those beautiful moments. So I hope I didn't go too far out. But that was a whole lot of information to explain north and south of the compass, which is the religion. It's suffering or creating suffering or avoiding suffering in things that we can control. So that's what it is.
No, that's really unique way of looking at it. And I appreciate that, because I think, and you can tell me if I'm reading this wrong, but it sounds like if you try to go too far on the south side of the compass there, you end up in a fundamentalism.
Yes.
Where you're just what's the old saying? Too heavenly minded that you're no earthly good.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly, exactly.
And you're calling for a middle space there where we can
finding the balance.
But view them through the lens of spirituality.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So what's east and west then?
Now, east and west is suffering and things that we cannot control. But east and west, like I said, north and south is adversity and things that we can control, that bad things happen because we chose poorly, or good things happen because we choose good. We have a better life because we have these investments of long-term behaviors. East and west is the big bad suffering that we can't control. It's things that happen. It's just those horrible storms in our life that changes our identity. It takes everything from us. It's our path of everything we thought life was going to be. It ends and it stops, and we are kind of just left there. And that's what East and West represents. Now, this is where the spiritual stuff starts kicking in. So I always say that West represents that this is just life, you know. Everything, every bit of weird suffering, you can't always find purpose in. And if you always try to find purpose in any kind of suffering, you'll be constantly stuck in this place of woe is me, you know, in a not a great place. So the West is science, man. Use science, use psychology, get into therapy, do what you have to do just to get through it, you know. But don't allow yourself to lay down, sit down, and stop and give up. But you got to figure out a way to keep moving forward, you know, to keep progressing. Now, East is finding purpose in the suffering. And that's like where post-traumatic growth happens, that it changes your identity. But like as in post-traumatic growth, you come out where they would say higher evolved, thinking differently, almost a new identity. It's almost like a different you, but it's like a more balanced you. You are wiser and smarter and can do more.
Integration.
Integration, yes. And a friend of mine who is in a part of post-traumatic growth therapy, and he's a part of where they help soldiers who suffer from, you know, post-traumatic stress disorder. They come here, they come to a place, and they all come in and help them so they can find post-traumatic growth. He and I, and he's a part of that therapy. But he had told me that they studied Vietnam veterans, prisoners of war. And he said there was something that's strange that happened in these prisoners of war that had a very short stint in when they were being held captive, that it just messed them up. And it was a lot of struggling and work to try to get them back to just a place that could help. He said, but the people that were there the long term, he said what they found is there were some weird things that happened. Those who gave into it and let it change them and transform it came out higher developed. And that's what started this dive into this term they call now post-traumatic growth, that it was through studying these people of how that happened and why that happened. Now, I use that term, but I didn't get it from there. I got it from the teachings of Jesus, where Jesus says to his disciples, deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me, that whosoever loses their life for my sake shall find it. And then I started thinking about what he was talking about, and that Jesus was going through some stuff. He's going to be crucified and tortured. So Jesus knew what he was facing, and Jesus didn't want to do it. Scriptures are pretty clear about that, because Jesus goes into the Garden of Gethsemane and he says, I don't want to do this. You know, he sweat blood, that however you can frame it and think of it, he was there begging God, I don't want to do this. Let this cup pass from me. I want no part of it. But he had to stay there until he said, okay, all right, your will be done. And as soon as he gave in at the Garden of Gethsemane, it took him to dying to self at the cross, which is what that would represent for us in these moments of suffering that we're trying to make have purpose, but we find life. So on the cross, symbolically, what he wanted has to die. This gets very archetypal. This gets very, you know, Jungian. This is definitely the hero's journey, except Jesus does it differently than everybody else. So he has to die to self. He has to die to what he wanted, to how he was. He will never do what he did again. I mean, he was the miracles of feeding people by the thousands and the healings and the casting out demons. You know, he is about to move away from what he was, and he'll never do that again. So he dies on the cross, which takes him to the tomb. The hero's journey calls it the cave. That's what that is in the story. Now, the circumstances that put him into the cave don't change. So that doesn't change, but the circumstances are used to change him. So as he is in this tomb, he is going through a transformation. It's like a cocoon. He is going through becoming something different, something more highly evolved, something that imparts wisdom and help. And the third day, the number of synthesis, he rises up, you know, he's back. And then he spends 40 days of witnessing. In that 40 days after witnessing, he doesn't heal anybody, doesn't cast out any demons, he doesn't perform the miracles he did before. What he does is he witnesses with his scars. That's why I call the series I do Scars That Speak. The Scars That Speak series, and it comes from Jesus, the divine scars, and that he let the scars speak in ways that words can't. It was like Thomas, when Thomas seen him, he had to touch his scars, and his scars spoke to Thomas in a way that he needed to hear it, that he could have heard it no other way for him to get to where he needed to be. So I think that's part of this process. And then Jesus, the last thing he said was to his disciples, now you go make other disciples. What I've been sharing with you, you go share with others. So I think that's what East represents to me, is it represents finding purpose in the suffering. And then Jesus says, now deny yourself, pick up your cross and follow me. And if we follow him through that process, that's actually the steps of post-traumatic growth. That's how I was speaking at a church, and I was talking about these 5 steps of the life cycles of Christ. And that's how I met him. He came up afterwards and he says, you don't know what you just was talking about and what you were speaking to, but you literally just nailed post-traumatic growth of what we teach to people that's went through post-traumatic stress disorder. So that's how I learned that. It was like a confirmation of kind of hermeneutical pluralisms, of how I read it in that way, that it could be applicable. So yeah, that's East. That's where we find purpose of the suffering, and we push in with God, and through that we find transformation. Now, do I believe that God does that to us? No, I don't. I think this is just life. But I think that we can find a higher purpose through this process that Jesus was talking about.
I was going to ask you about that, because you do talk a good amount about suffering in the podcast.
I do.
And it sounds like you're dissatisfied with the churchy answers of, well, God's just testing you, or Satan's tempting you, or it's just going to make you better in the end. So when you kind of step back from all that, would you say that suffering has inherent meaning, or is it more just what we give it to try to make sense of it?
Well, that is a complex question. It's a loaded question. Here's what I would say. First of all, let's redefine, or let's define suffering. I think a lot of times what we call suffering, it isn't suffering. It's just being taught. I mean, if you think about, like you were saying, college, as you were going through college, you were sacrificing things in order to be there to learn, but it was getting you to a better place. Would you call that suffering? No, I wouldn't call it suffering.
Maybe before a midterm, but no.
Yeah, I would call that sacrifice. So I think sometimes where we get off track is we call things suffering that aren't suffering, and even in suffering, we can still find life. And I think that's the message. So I think the word parasmos means being tempted or tested, not tempted in a negative context. But it doesn't say the devil in James. It says that in Jesus, they both say that it's us. This is what we want.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
Yeah. But being tested means you're being formed. Now, Jesus does say in Luke 8:13 that those who receive this word, this promise of life, that think that it's going to be all joy, that in a time of testing, they'll fall away because they have no roots. They didn't get grounded. And James talks about it in verses 2-4 in chapter 1 about this suffering, and Peter talks about it in First Peter 6 and 7 about it purifying, and then of course Romans 5:1-5. Paul uses the word thalipsis, which is like being restricted, but forcing us into a better place. But that's not like suffering. That's being prepared. This is a good lesson for us. Let's talk about this. I mean, if we think about David and what he went through. When he was out with the sheep, out in the middle of nowhere by himself, because he was kind of cast aside by his father and thought little of, I think some of us would define that as this isn't fair and this is suffering. But David didn't. Yeah, David's seen it as, this is what I'm going to do my absolute best where I'm at. I'm going to make the most of it. And I have this imagery in my head that the other shepherds around was watching David kind of far off. And they had to be shaking their head because here comes a bear, so he's got to fight and kill this bear. So, and then it's a lion, he's fighting all these apex predators, and the other shepherds are like, what's going on with David? And did David say he was suffering though? And I think if I'm in that place and I'm pushed aside from everybody else, and I'm out here having to watch these sheep, which is a demeaning kind of a position. And then on top of that, I'm being attacked by the bear, having to defend and kill the bear and kill the lion and all these other predators. Would I call that suffering? I would think, man, this just seems so unfair. But at the same time, that's how he was being prepared. That's how God trained him. That was not just happenstance. That's where God wanted him. When you think about Saul, who trained up Saul? The priest. He was at the tabernacle. He was being doted on. He was being prepared. And God said, no, you're my man. I want you out here. This is where I want you. This is where I'm going to teach you. How did God teach him? We always think that God is just going to give us this magical ability to do things. And that's not how it works. You're trained up through sometimes what we would call suffering. I don't think David would call it suffering. That's just life. This is what you do. But when he's going through all that, and then his father says, you know what, I want you to go take lunch to your brothers. And he says, okay. And then he goes there, and who does he see? He sees Goliath out there. What I want us all to hear when David sees Goliath is that wasn't his giant. That's Saul's giant. That's not his. And everyone's afraid of this giant. But that's Saul's giant. Where was Saul grown at? He was grown where it's easy. There was no adversity to have to get through. There was no out alone by yourself with God, contemplating your faith. There was no time of having to fight the predators and figure out how you do this. That's God teaching David. So when he sees Goliath, it's like God said to David, what are you going to do? And David says, I'm going to go slay that giant. That's right. Go slay that giant. And so Saul says, yeah, which I think is crazy. Saul says, let's watch this kid get killed.
Right, yeah.
He says,
Good leader.
Hey, take my armor. And so hey, you're prophesied to be the king. Yeah, go ahead. Take my armor. Go out there and fight the giant. So, and David puts it on. And then in my head, I'm seeing him hearing from God saying, that's not what I told you to do. That's not what I taught you to do. Get that off of you and go do what I showed you to do. And David says, I can't do this. I can't wield this sword and wear this. Just take this off of me. Let me do what I've done when I was out there in the field. And what's he do? He goes out and he slays Goliath because that's what God had been training and teaching him to do. And then you think, that's it, right? Oh, I'm going to be king. God is preparing me. And God says, I am preparing you. Now, here's a ragtag bunch. Saul, go kill David. So how did David learn how to be a leader in adversity? Because God taught him in adversity. Get out there and let this king chase you around with 1,000 of his best. Go kill David. Come on, David. What are you going to do? Come on. Let's go. Had to be hard. Now, but do you think David seen that as suffering? Or did David see that as, this is what I've been given to do, so this is what I'm going to do? But later on, now when David is king, because David was a warring king, and that's what God was preparing him to be, is a leader of men in war. So when he was out with these opponents, these powerful kings, these mighty kings, and he had to lead his armies and his people through a great amount of adversity, he had already been trained for this. God had already prepared him for this.
That's trying to movies find some meaning in it. Yeah, for sure.
And then when he went to the tabernacle, what did he do? He went in where he shouldn't have went into as a high priest and wore their robes, and he praised and thanked God in the Holy of Holies. He represented, he was a precursor to Jesus. So is that suffering? Yeah. I think some of us in our culture would think that's suffering. I think that we are so comfortable with our modern conveniences as we don't realize the difference between being prepared for something. Because the truth is, Colin, we are all being prepared, or should be, to be giant slayers, except for giants today have different names. They're not called Goliath. They're called hunger,
Mm,
they're called homelessness. They're called
mm.
addiction. They're called
Things
sex
that we should
traffic.
be prepping to help with as Christians, and
Yeah,
instead we focus on everything else, and we get a stubbed toe, and we wonder why God's testing us because of
yeah,
all the
yeah,
conveniences we have.
yeah. So there is a huge difference, and that's what I mean by
Mm,
scars that speak. I know a person that is going to be on the show, and that's what they do. They rescue sex traffic workers. But a lot of the people that
mm,
do that were former sex trafficked workers. They have certain scars that I don't have. They can speak to them in a way that I can't. They have a
yeah,
way of slaying the Goliath that's called sex trafficking, that in a way that I can't, that my words won't speak to them. So that's horrific that you've been in there. But when we come across somebody that has need, that has a Goliath that's not ours, no matter the name, then we need to be prepared and ready to step up. So I
mm,
think that too much of our faith is centered about what's God doing for me. And that's how it starts. But we should be evolved to the point where we become that ministry of Jesus, that we are the
mm,
attributes of Him manifest. And
yeah,
when you get involved in a church, not all churches, I got to be very clear, but when you get involved in that merit based religion on a mountain, that you're trying to aspire to be like this hierarchy above you, you're not being grown to do that. You're staying on that square one, and you're not on your path and your journey to be developed and evolved, to be the giant killer, to be the one that brings love where there is no love and hope where there is no hope. So,
mm,
define suffering again. I don't know. But there is a huge difference, because that's why I have scars that speak. And one of the episodes is Brent McKay telling the story about his 10-year-old son in the cancer ward,
mm,
where he has this moment of breaking in his faith and his religion, where he just throws it to God. But it's in that moment where he gives up this merit-based religion that has been so oppressive, where God meets him there. And he don't even know it.
mm.
He doesn't know it until later that God met him in his situation. That kind of suffering, yeah, that's real suffering. Is that God? No, that's not God. That's life. Life
Mm.
happens, and it's entropy. And
Yeah,
you
it's
talked
like
about,
yeah,
yeah,
using your compass. It's like life draws us up into that like northwest section, just
yeah,
the things that
that's
happen,
exactly right.
and trying to follow Jesus is like pulling us back southeast into center.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I say. In the very center of this compass is the commandment of Christ from John 13,
Mm,
34, and 35, is to love one another as I've loved you. By this, the world will know you're my disciple. That we are called to
yes.
be followers and disciples of Christ. There's a difference in being a disciple and being a
Oh, good. I
worshiper
was
of the
just going to
deity
ask
of
you to get
Christ.
into this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
that's
let's
the
explore
difference.
this.
Yeah.
What is the
Yeah.
difference? Because so many times in church we say, we sing songs of worship to Jesus, and we preach about that. But you're saying that what Jesus actually calls us to do is follow him, and that makes a big difference. So let's explore that now.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love to. So, in a merit based faith, because so much of, and I want to be very careful, because I am not, let's tear the church down and start. That's not me at all. I mean, I can go into any church, and most of the time I feel pretty good there. I
Mm,
get along with fundamentalists. I get along with anybody, whatever your faith is. If you're a
mm,
deconstructionist, I have friends that's secular humanist. My faith is my faith, though. And it seems
yeah.
like the things I say that kind of appeal to a lot of different people. But I have said that there's a big difference in being a worshiper of the deity of Christ in that religion, where you take that commandment of Christ and you put it on a pedestal, and you thank God and you praise God for this antidote to the poison that's in humanity. But you
Mhm,
don't consume this word, Luke 8:11 through 15, the word, and become that, but rather you thank God for it, and then you use that as an excuse to put your shortcomings, your guilt, and your anxiousness, your anger, and we would say our sins onto Jesus, and then use that as an excuse to live how we want.
mm,
Rather, becoming a disciple. Jesus didn't come to start a religion. Jesus came to get disciples and followers that behaved like he did, that we are supposed to be his attributes. I think of it as in spiritual lineage, that Jesus was the first fruit-bearing tree, and the fruits that he bore is like what Acts, 10:38 says. Jesus went about doing good, healing the sick, casting out demons. He fed people. I mean, where Jesus seen a need, he addressed it. He took care of it. Not like a doormat, but as a good steward would. Now, if you're a good steward, if you're my steward, right? If you're over me and I'm hungry, you're going to say, well, Chris, go eat. Go get yourself something to eat. You need money? Go get a job. But now if I'm hungry and I can't feed myself, well, you have stewardship of me. You're going to feed me. My hunger now becomes your hunger. You're responsible for my hunger. You're responsible for my sickness. You're responsible for my destitute position in life, and you need to address it and try to help me. That's how Jesus loved. Now, when you look at the commandment of Christ, Jesus says to his disciples, now love one another as I have loved. And everybody wants to talk about, but Jesus talked about the other one in Leviticus 19:18. Yes, he did. And he says, that this is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and your might, and love thy neighbor as thyself. But what Jesus was telling his disciples is, that's the commandment. But now you've seen me as your example of how to do it. Now you go do it like I did it, because that's the way it's to be done. And that's what I want from you. Be my disciple. Be just like me, but not in how I eat, not in how I dress, not in how I cut my hair, not where I live, but how I love, like God said to love. And if you'll do that, you'll start changing the world around you. You'll start, bringing a healing to humanity, not by trying to change humanity, but just by becoming the antidote to the poison that's in it. So being a disciple of Christ or follower of Christ means you become just like him in how he loved. When the opportunity presents itself, then you do the right thing, even when it's not convenient, versus being a worshiper of the deity of Christ, of seeing the church as the destination and you're fulfilling your purpose rather than what it is, which is a table of encouragement to encourage you to keep going and pursuing this path of becoming like Jesus. But we stop and hold up short because we see the church as the destination, and we're doing our part by coming and paying our tithes and singing and one is a worshiper of the deity of Christ, but it never manifests the commandment. The other is becoming like Jesus and becoming his attribute, that we are carrying on his ministry for him. We bear the same fruit he did through that spiritual lineage, what he started and how it came to you, of whoever it came to, that now you carry it on. You have to grow in it, but you will be the one to carry it on. So that's what I mean by being a disciple of Christ versus being a worshiper of the deity of Christ. They're two different things. You can be both, but you don't necessarily aren't by default both. You have to choose from your cardia to become that disciple.
Oh, yeah. And I absolutely love how you bring this out, because I think what we have focused on in American Christianity is being a worshiper of the deity of Christ.
For sure.
And that's why you can have so many people who claim to be Christian, go to church every week, give money to church every week, and they turn the other way when there's abuse in the church, or they'll not care for the homeless in their community, or they'll lie and manipulate, and it's all good because they're a really hard worker in the church, they volunteer a lot of time. It's like, okay, that may be, but that doesn't mean you're actually following Jesus.
That's right. That's right. When I think about James, which the pastor of the Church of Jerusalem, ground zero for Christianity, of what kind of pastor he was, he could have put his throne at the very top of the mountain and sat and watched everybody trying to aspire to be like him and work their way up in this organization, which is kind of what we've made out of this merit-based religion. But he didn't. He took the posture of Christ. He got in the ditch and started helping people out of the ditch. He became a servant and trying to manifest this discipleship in himself to others. He was trying to help other people circumvent suffering and get through it. And that's what a good pastor should do. But that looks like a completely different church than this mountain-based church. The mountain-based church looks amazingly pharisaical, doesn't it? Doesn't it look like the temple of when Jesus showed up and they didn't recognize him, that it was so legal and so literal? And Jesus was the living word of God, logos. And I think about the Bible, which is the scripture, but the most powerful thing that I think about is what Jesus wrote. And that's because he wrote nothing. He became an example. It's hard to land on a literal place when he just gave us an example, and it's people writing about that example. There's something that's very in the ethos, living, alive in that the Bible's the instruction manual and it tells you where to go, but the life happens out here where we're at, because that's where the good stuff is. This is where Logos is.
That's kind of makes me think of a car owner's manual. It'll tell you how to keep the thing running, but it won't tell you where to go with it.
That's right. Yeah. I think that's a personal relationship situation. There's no way that, I talk about that a lot, that we all have a path and a journey, and none of our paths are alike, but we all have the same destination, that we all are to become like Christ in this love. And I think of Peter and John the Beloved and their relationship, that Peter had a different relationship altogether than John Beloved. Now, when they were together in community, they did have this imagery of God, of Jesus, and they seen God in a community, which is kind of one-dimensional, but it's encouraging and it's comforting. But one-on-one, Peter had a relationship with Jesus that challenged him and pushed him hard. But that's what Peter needed. And his relationship with John the Beloved was very nurturing and much more caring and loving. But if he would have treated John like he treated Peter, he would have traumatized John. And if he would have treated Peter like he treated John, Peter wouldn't have gotten to where he needed to. But ultimately, they both ended up in the same place. They ended up in the same destination, and they both were willing to be martyred for this commandment of Christ. And, they fully developed, but is what they needed, two different paths to get to the same place.
And you've mentioned to me something from your own path about a sunset and a groundhog that are a little unique.
I did. Yeah. So, and this is a huge part of why I think I see things like I do and what has kept me where I'm at. And because I've had three major points in my life. And one was in 2006, and one happened in 2020, 14 years apart. And I've talked about it a couple times, and that's what people typically want to talk about. But there was an event that happened at 2010 that made how I see scripture and how I see things like I do kind of made that possible. And it's a weird thing. And for some people, this might even be hard to hear. But in 2010, I was going through a lot of hard times. There was a lot of suffering in my life, and some of it was just self-inflicted. I was going through a divorce. She was living in the house. I was working probably 70, 80 hours a week. And I rented another house kind of outside of town, out in the country. And the backyard backed up to just fields. It was just open fields. And in the backyard, there was this structure. It's just like what we would call here in Kentucky, an outbuilding. And there was a stack of material that was left over that the owner of the property had just left there. And it was about 3.5 foot tall. Well, at that time in my life, I was just filling my life with distractions. I had this job, and in every bit of my free time, I was filling it with, it was online. I was diving into my favorite hobbies. I was dating a tremendous amount of different people and women I shouldn't have been dating. That, I was not in a good place in my life. And I was like a lot of us currently in life. And that's what I was chasing. And what I say is typically, when you have an experience with what I would say God or the divine, and it's anecdotal, so I'm not saying that's what it was, but that's how I would perceive it, that you're pushing in, looking for God. And in this moment, I wasn't. I was looking for pleasure. I was definitely in the thorns. I was getting into the thorns. I wasn't deep yet, but I was getting, into them. But I was coming home and it was sunset. I'd been at the grocery store and I came in and I pulled into the driveway and I seen in the backyard on that stack of material what looked to be like a very large stuffed animal. It was dark brown, but it looked odd to me. I was like, something is off. And in my mind, I'm thinking about the women I'd been with and possibly, what's going on, who's here, and this and that. And so I just leave my groceries in the car and I just start easing my way down to it. And I'm disturbed that somebody's been there when I'm not there to do that, because it was left in a weird way. So I come around to the back of it and I'm like, that doesn't look like a stuffed animal, but it's not moving. It's just standing up there. It's just being really still, but I don't think it's a stuffed animal. So I kind of flank around to it and I put myself between it and the house. So if I need to get away quickly, I can. And I'm at a good, healthy distance here. I'm probably 30 feet or so. And I come around to the side and I realize this is a groundhog. And it's a very large groundhog. I mean, this thing is probably, I don't know, from where I was standing, it looked like it was getting close to 3 feet tall. And it was just standing there like as a statue. And I thought something was wrong with the groundhog. So I start getting closer and closer, but it's just staring. And then I get really interested in what is this thing staring at?
Yeah.
I get closer and I get closer. Now I get about 20 foot from it, maybe somewhere in there. And I'm looking, but I can't see anything because the sun is in my eyes. And I'm like, what is this thing looking at? There's nothing out there. And then it finally hits me. This groundhog is watching the sunset. So how many times in your life do you have the opportunity to watch a sunset with a feral animal? Well, you don't. And so I get a little bit closer to it, and I'm probably 20 foot from it. And now it turns and it looks at me. Now its posture doesn't change. It doesn't seem aggressive or anything else. It just stops, turns, and makes eye contact and stares at me for about 7 seconds. It doesn't ever come down and get into a defensive posture or like it's going to run or aggressive. It just turns and looks at me while it's still standing there. And I look at it and we lock eyes for about 7 seconds. And then it turns back and it just goes back to watching the sunset. So I get closer. I get about 12 to 15 foot from it. We're about maybe a little closer, maybe 10 feet. Maybe 8, but no closer than that. And I just start watching the sunset with this groundhog. But this is where it gets interesting. I had an experience. Everybody gets caught up in the groundhog that it was watching the sunset. But as I'm watching and looking at the sunset, I start seeing it go down. It's a process, not an event. But internally, things start. I'm out of sync with the sunset. So my cadence starts matching with the sunset. And the sunset in that moment of how I felt, and I realized internally I'd been putting all of this plastic stuff into my cardia, my heart, my center, my essence. I didn't have anything good in there. And it felt so false compared to me standing with this groundhog watching the sunset. And then I had this moment where I realized that I wasn't traveling in the universe, that I was a part of the universe. And the universe wasn't God, but it was an aspect of God. And that I was understanding it wrong and I was out of sync with God's creation. And so as I stood there and watched that sunset go down, watched the sun drop, my cadence slowed down and my metronome matched up to it. And as it did, I started to feel peace. Now, I wouldn't have told you it was like this at the time, but recently I watched a story because I'm just going to bring somebody on that is an expert in psychedelics and scriptures and higher writings of how it's played into it. Yeah. So I finished up with the groundhog, by the way. I was about there 10, 12 minutes. And I had this weird experience where I experienced the universe and my connection to God in that. Very strange. And I went in and then I watched out the window and the groundhog watched the sunset and then it left. So it was different. But I was watching this special on psychedelics trying to get ready because I don't know anything about psychedelics. I had never tried them. I have no desire to try them. It's strange to me. And there was all these people talking about psychedelics and their experience with them. And I realized that some of the stuff they had described is what I had experienced, except without hallucination and without weird stuff. And they
Okay.
described saying, I felt a part of the universe. I felt connected. I felt that I wasn't an individual, that I was a part of something bigger. And I was like,
Yeah.
wow, that's exactly what I experienced, except I didn't have the hallucinations. And I was coming from a place of suffering, so it was given to me in a different way. And I realized that when you are coming and experimenting with psychedelics or you're parting with psychedelics, it's not the same. That you come away with some knowledge that you have no idea what to do with. And there were some people that was on there that later committed suicide. And I thought, oh, that's horrible. And I started realizing that they had become more lost from the experience, you know? And that,
Mhm.
and it's like I was given a wisdom in that would serve me later. And uh, and I thought, man, so it was just preparing me for the psychedelics, you know, the episode, not that I would, because I'm not doing psychedelics, but I realized that I had an experience that God had allowed me to have that would help me. Now, at the time, I had no idea why it happened. It was so surreal. It was weird, but it was impacting and it stayed with me. And it's evolved and it's changed and it's kind of morphed into where I'm at now. So
Mm.
I, I've also studied other people's, especially spiritual philosophy. I mean, I could probably teach on the Bhagavad Gita and the Upanishads and Advaita Vedanta and Namarupa and all that stuff. But I mean, I'm a Christian and I'm
Mhm.
not inner spirituality. I'm about my faith. But there is some spiritual wisdom that comes from those other writings that I have looked at the Bible and it's given me a different understanding. Now, I will
Mm.
tell you that everybody that I know that comes from Christianity that I've talked to, that once they get into studying some of that stuff, they kind of get lost in it and they almost take on a Buddhist perspective. They start seeing the universe as
Mm.
consciousness and they start seeing that there is no objective good or evil or angels or devils. It's just us and there's personas. And I do believe there is a lens or a layer of that, of truth, but there's
Mm.
also other lenses and layers. What kept me from going down that path was my experience with a groundhog. And
Mm.
instead of taking me deeper out into that, it brought me right back to the scriptures and Jesus and reading and having the understanding, like I shared with you, of the tabernacle, of the three and the two, and that we belong to something bigger. All of that comes from that experience and understanding Namarupa and expand and an understanding kind of the quantum and what Hindus would call non-duality and Brahman, and what Buddhists would call consciousness, that because of all that, in my faith, I would call it God's will or pneuma
Mm.
or the Holy Spirit, that I would see kind of like Einstein saw it, that the quantum is the will of God. I mean, it's not God, but it's an aspect of God. It's his will. You know, God's outside the universe in that eternal state, predates time, predates, has always been, will always be, has always been there. Everything in the universe there's nothing in the universe that's eternal because the universe had a starting point. It could be everlasting, but it can't be eternal. So all of that ideas of the philosophical slants that took me into my own faith deeper came from that experience. Had not had that experience in 2010, that later on when I was exposed in a weird way of what took me to that, I don't know if I would have kept my faith, you know?
Mm.
But because of that experience, man, it took me right back to the Bible. So yeah, it was different and it was weird. And it reminds me of the old movie The Matrix. And he says, was that a black cat? Was that the same cat? And I said, wait a
Right.
second, was that a different cat or was that the same cat? He goes, it
Yep.
was the same cat. That's kind of how it was. It's kind of how it felt when I look back. It was just so weird. It was just like, you know, it was just like God tweaked the quantum for a second and something happened and is there a purpose to it? I have no idea. I'm not trying to say there is. I'm not even trying to say it's God. It's anecdotal. It's my experience but it had such a profound impact on me of how I read the scripture now.
And it sounds like it gave you a little humility in your approach too in dealing with other beliefs.
Oh, yeah.
At least like where I came from, the fundamentalism was always afraid of everything else. It was apologetics, trying to prove why they're wrong and we're right. And I love how you've expressed, you're strong in your Christianity. You're not saying, oh, I think everything's equally right, but you're also not out there attacking everyone else. You're drawing from them and saying, well, here's a few things I might differ on, but this is something I think we're on the same page about. And that's really powerful.
Perennialism, I think it's called. There's a difference in being inner spirituality. Well, I mean, I had Brian Muldoon on, who was personal friends with Wayne Teasdale, who was a very famous Catholic layman monk, but who was also of the Advaita Vedanta tradition monk and Hinduism, and he wore the robes of both. Brian shared that they were getting ready for, I think it was in 1992, that it was the World Religion Conference, that they were going to get together and have all these different religions and have the synthesis conversation. Well, the Dalai Lama was going to be a part of that. So they went to the Dalai Lama's home to meet with him, because Wayne Teasdale and the Dalai Lama were very good friends. And so was the Dalai Lama's brother and Wayne. And when they got there, there was all these lepers lined up begging for money. And Brian said that Wayne didn't care who you were, that if people were hurting, he was going to be trying to fix that situation. So he insisted that him and Brian not give money, because they didn't really have a lot to give, or food, but they go and help, that they go hang out and get to know these people. So Brian was like, okay. So they went over, got to know these lepers, talked to them. And then Wayne went in and talked to the people that was over where the Dalai Lama lived and said, this is outrageous. This is right. This should not be happening. Someone needs to go take care of these people. This is wrong. You guys need to learn compassion. Even though he's friends with the Dalai Lama, he didn't care to call him out either. And I had made the statement that, because he's seen himself as a disciple of Christ, and that's what he was doing, no matter where he was at. He was loving people, and he said he was the same way with animals. But, he was a part of inner spirituality, where this feeling that you practiced a lot of different religions. I would say I'm not of that. I'm more perennialist, which means I can see some of the other things that religions share, but my faith is in Christ. For those people that would say, well, Sri Krishna and Jesus are the same thing, and they taught the same. Well, I promise you they did not. They are not the same. There's a huge difference. Jesus would tell you to love your enemies, and, that we become the antidote to the poison. And Sri Krishna told Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, if you don't go destroy them, I will raise somebody else up. Besides, you can't kill what's eternal anyway. Go destroy them. So, two different teachings there. One was love to a degree. They believe in that Sri Krishna would teach Dharma, that you have a path that no matter what, you have to fulfill. And Jesus would say, our love is the path, and that we have no enemies. We take care of everyone. So they're not the same, but I do see the value in the things they teach. And there's some things I've said on the podcast from the Bhagavad Gita, like we all see God and experience God in the way we need to. So we get to where it's not about us getting God right. It's about us understanding how we need to see him so we can fulfill what we need to in our life. That was some influence that I got from the Bhagavad Gita. But yeah, I see it as, I wouldn't say religion. I can't imagine that adding more religion on top of my religion is going to make me more spiritually awake or alive. I think it just makes me more religious. But I think the spiritual philosophy that they offer, that through a different lens, it gives me more insight into my faith. And that's what I would say about it. But I do think it's good reading for me. I wouldn't suggest other people, do it. But for me, it's been helpful. But, ultimately it comes back down to the Bible for me.
I appreciate you sharing all that. And I just realized we've been talking for an hour already.
Oh, wow.
So I really appreciate you taking this time and sharing all that. It's very personal, very enlightening. I appreciate the approach that you take. So for anyone that has listened to this whole conversation and they're going to be back in the church pew this week, and maybe previously they've been confident that they're getting it right because they believe the right stuff about Jesus.
Yeah.
What would you hope maybe unsettles or reframes their perspective after hearing this conversation?
I would hope that what you would take with you is the challenge that should happen in the mirror, not in community. But
Mm,
am I becoming a disciple of Christ? Am I becoming the fruit of his labor? Or am I
mm.
just becoming more religious and indoctrinated, that I am becoming a stronger in the worship of the deity of Christ? Or am I truly on my path of becoming what I should become? And that's the antidote to the poison.
Mm. It's a great message. I really appreciate you taking the time, Chris. Thanks for being here with us this week. I want to give you the last minute here. You can rep your podcast, anything else that you might be working on, or how listeners can find you.
Yeah, Colin, thank you so much. I appreciate it. And to everybody that stayed to this point, thank you. Because I know, man, I can take off and go running. But hey, if you would like to contact me, you can reach out to me at spiritualhotsauce@gmail.com. I'm also on Facebook at Spiritual Hot Sauce. You can connect with me there. My podcast, Spiritual Hot Sauce, is on Spotify. It's on Apple Podcasts, just anywhere, it's everywhere. And it's also on YouTube. But I would appreciate anybody that wants to hear more, come over and say hi and connect with me. That'd be fantastic. And I appreciate the time, and I appreciate this opportunity to get to talk about my podcast a little bit. And for those people that are in Louisville, this probably won't be airing, but if you connect with me in Facebook, but like this Sunday, I'll be speaking at Daylight Church, but I speak there from time to time in other places. That if you connect with me on Facebook, anytime I'm going to be speaking, I post it there. So if you want to come say hi and hang out at a church with me while I speak, that'd be great.
Awesome. Well, we'll link to that. And, we usually end all of our episodes saying to stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible.
Mhm.
And I want to expand that this week and just say, stay curious and keep asking questions, not just about the Bible, but about faith, about spirituality, about the people around you, about the little groundhogs that are there in your life that you might miss.
Yeah.
Go be curious, go ask questions about it, and it might just change your life.
You never know. You never know. Just, hang in there with the Lord. Push in with God, and he'll push in with you.
Absolutely.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.